A house blazing with Christmas lights hides something far darker, drawing Hamish Macbeth into another quiet Highland mystery. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't, and your support truly helps. Hamish had been enjoying the last of the evening peat fire when the knock came. It was a sharp little tap, the sort that meant someone was worked up. Luggs lifted his head and gave a low whine. Hamish opened the door to find Mrs. Patel standing there with her coat half buttoned and her face red from the cold and annoyance. "It's that house on the hill," she said. "You'll need to come out." Hamish pulled on his jacket, wishing he had ignored the knock. Mrs. Patel marched ahead of him like a woman delivering bad news to a council office. When they reached the road, he saw it at once. The new Cranston house blazed with lights in what was clearly only a test run. Strings of white and blue icicles hung from every gutter. A Santa sleigh pulsed red across the roof. Reindeer pranced along the hedge like they were racing to escape. The whole hillside glared down on Loch Dhu, which looked dingy and defeated under it. "It's an eyesore," said Mrs. Patel. "Folk are complaining already." Hamish squinted at it. "It's their house." She gave him a sharp look. "There's children crying because they can't sleep." Hamish doubted that, but said nothing. The loch reflected the glow in wide streaks of cheap colour. It looked like one of those garish postcards tourists bought when they didn't know any better. By morning, gossip had turned sour. Mrs. Wellington stopped him outside the post office, her voice low as if the lights were a personal insult. "My nativity looks like nothing at all now. That English pair have made a mockery of Christmas." Hamish tried to move on, but she caught his sleeve with surprising grip. "You must talk to them." Inside Patel's shop, crofters muttered over the counter. One claimed his electricity had flickered 3 times in the night. Another said the glare had frightened his collie. A fisherman announced that his wife hadn't slept because their curtains weren't thick enough. It was all said in that polite Highland way, which made the hostility fiercer. By midday, the Kirk Hall was full. Cold air came in each time the door opened. Hamish faced them, lanky and uncomfortable in his worn sweater. They all stared back as if he had personally installed every last bulb. "Do something," someone called. "There's no law against bad taste," Hamish said. "There should be," growled a fisherman at the back. Mrs. Wellington stood again. "They've ruined the meaning of the season. A man's simple display can't compete." Hamish felt himself going red. He muttered something about speaking to the Cranstons. He had no intention of doing that, but the crowd looked ready to carry him up the hill if he refused. Someone must have gone ahead, because that evening the Cranstons appeared outside Patel's shop, both in matching red jumpers that made them look like an advert. They smiled too widely and spoke too loudly. Mr. Cranston clapped Hamish on the arm. "We'd like to invite the whole village to the official switching on, spread goodwill and all that." "That's kind of you," Mrs. Patel said in a flat tone that meant it wasn't kind at all. Hamish tried to escape, but the Cranstons hovered near him like cheerful gnats. "You'll do the honours, Constable," said Mr. Cranston. "It'll mean a lot." Hamish muttered something that could be taken as agreement. The crowd grew quickly. Crofters stood with their hands deep in their pockets. A few tourist couples had wandered up, thinking it all very quaint. Luggs whined at Hamish's side. He didn't blame the dog. When the time came, Hamish stepped forward. His uniform looked shabby beside the bright clothes of the Cranstons. Mrs. Cranston giggled nervously. "Just pull the lever." Hamish pulled it. The hillside exploded into light. Folk gasped. Children covered their eyes. Mrs. Wellington swore quietly under her breath. The house looked worse lit all at once. Even the loch seemed offended, reflecting the chaos in smeared lines. Then a crackle came from the fuse box near the gate. Several villagers jumped back. A woman said she smelled burning. Hamish felt the pressure of 50 eyes turning on him. "It's nothing," he said. He didn't believe it. Anything that ugly was bound to go wrong. But he stood there, pretending calm, as if he hadn't just unleashed the worst sight Loch Dhu had seen in years. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering. The Cranstons beamed at everyone as if they had cured loneliness. Hamish trudged back down the hill with Luggs at his heels. The lights glared at his back like an accusation. In the quiet of the station, he poked the fire back into life and tried not to think of how tomorrow's gossip would choke the village like smoke. Luggs rested his head on Hamish's knee. Outside, the hillside blazed on, stubborn and tasteless, promising more trouble. Hamish sighed. Folk would expect him to fix something he had never wanted to start. Hamish knew the evening would go wrong the moment he saw the coach inching up the narrow road like some great sulking beast. The headlights swept across the damp verges and startled Angus's sheep, which scattered and then bunched again in front of the coach wheels. Angus stood in the rain shouting, though the tourists inside the coach seemed to find it all charming. Hamish did not. He had been dragged from his peat fire to direct traffic for a house he disliked on sight. Cold drizzle hung over the loch. It made the tarmac shine with streaks of blue and red thrown down from the Cranstons' lights higher up the hill. The colours looked worse in the wet, as if the place were melting into itself. Lugs pressed against Hamish's leg and gave a quiet woof, annoyed by the noise. Hamish agreed with him. When Hamish finally got the coach to crawl past Angus and his sheep, it wheezed to a stop beside a row of small cars parked half up on the verge. Tourists stepped out in bright jackets. One woman said she'd never seen anything so delightful. Hamish wondered what kind of life she must lead if this was delightful. He didn't say it. He just motioned them towards the house. Inside, the Cranstons had set out trestle tables with mulled wine and mince pies. The wine smelled too sweet, and the pies looked bought in bulk. Mrs. Cranston fluttered about, apologising for the cheap paper napkins as though that mattered. Folk from Lochdu stood stiffly near the walls, pretending this was all perfectly normal. Hamish felt a headache coming on. "You've been kept busy, Constable," Mr. Cranston said, raising his cup. "Aye," Hamish said. He didn't elaborate. There was no point. Lugs waited near the door, ears flicking at every burst of laughter. The whole room had that trapped feeling, the kind that came from too many visitors and too much forced cheer. Folk were pretending to enjoy themselves, which always made Hamish feel tired. Then the power went out. It wasn't a gentle fade, it snapped. A hard, loud crack came from outside, and the house plunged into blackness. Someone gasped. A child started crying. Hamish stood still, letting his eyes adjust. He could hear the rain again tapping on the windows. Lugs growled, a low sound that made several tourists draw back. A woman screamed from the back garden. Hamish cursed under his breath and pushed past folk fumbling for torches. Someone handed him a lantern, one of those old camping things that smelled of paraffin. It gave a weak yellow glow. He hurried out into the cold. In the garden, the fairy lights lay limp and dead. Rain hit his face in hard little drops. The lantern beam shook as he moved it along the path. Then the light caught something at the base of the wall. A man lay sprawled under a ladder. His arm was tangled in a string of fairy lights. He looked oddly peaceful despite the mud. It was Gordon McFarlane, the electrician who had been fussing with the display all week. Mrs. Cranston began to cry softly. A tourist muttered that she wished she hadn't come. Hamish crouched down. The ladder's feet were too far from the wall, as if someone had given it a shove. The ground was disturbed, though rain had already started smoothing things. A broken bulb glinted near Gordon's hand. Hamish touched it lightly with a finger. It could mean something, or nothing. Folk broke things all the time. "Back, please," he said. "Give him space." The villagers obeyed, though with that slow reluctance that meant they'd talk about it all later and get it wrong. Blair arrived 20 minutes later, stomping through puddles and cursing the hill, the rain, and Christmas. Anderson followed behind him like a dog desperate not to be kicked. "What's this then?" Blair demanded. "Another daft accident. Too much drink and too many lights." "He didn't seem drunk," Hamish said. He stood up straight, though Blair always made him feel lankier and more awkward than usual. Blair sniffed loudly. "Electrician falls off a ladder. Hardly a mystery." He poked the ladder with his boot. "Should have tightened it. Foolish man." Hamish wanted to argue. He wanted to point out the ladder angle, the disturbed earth, the broken bulb. But Blair was already waving Anderson over, telling him to put accidental fall in his wee notebook. Anderson nodded eagerly. Mrs. Cranston stepped forward. "We only wanted some brightness," she said. Her voice trembled in a way that made Hamish uncomfortable. "Aye," Blair said. "Well, you've got it. The whole place looks like a circus." That remark angered the villagers. They wanted Blair to say the house was awful, but only after they had said it themselves. Now they felt mocked. Hamish could feel the hostility thickening in the wet air. Gossip started right there in the garden. Old Angus muttered, "Someone was bound to get hurt." Another crofter said Gordon had been complaining about shoddy cables. Someone else claimed he'd seen Gordon arguing with the Cranstons earlier, though Hamish suspected that was made up on the spot. Blair rounded on Hamish. "Well, you going to make something out of this? Or are you finally agreeing with me for once?" Hamish swallowed. He looked at the ground, then at the ladder, then at Gordon's still face. It didn't sit right, but he had nothing solid, only the wrong shape of things. Blair would sneer at guesses. "A slip," Hamish said quietly. "Maybe that's all it was." Blair smirked. "Good lad. Knew you'd see sense." Hamish felt the shame of that settle in his stomach. He had let Blair push him into agreement because it was easier than arguing. Lugs pressed close to his leg, ears pinned back. The dog didn't like it either. They carried Gordon's body into the house awkwardly and with muttering. Someone had draped a blanket over him that didn't quite reach his boots. The Cranstons stood together, hands clasped, looking like people who'd just learned that cheerfulness could turn savage on them. Blair made his quick announcements, promised a full report, then left with Anderson to sulk in Strathbane. Hamish stayed behind to calm the villagers. He had nothing useful to tell them, only empty comfort, which they didn't want. When the house finally emptied and only the Cranstons remained, Hamish gave one last look at the dead lights outside. They hung there like limp accusations against everyone. He felt tired and cold and annoyed with himself. On the walk back down the hill, the drizzle thickened. Lochdu was dark. Even the small street lamps looked weaker than usual. Lugg stayed close beside him, quiet and unhappy. Hamish told himself Gordon had slipped. He said it again in his mind, hoping it would settle. It didn't. Something was wrong, and he had already agreed with the wrong man about it. He reached the station and shut the door behind him. The room felt damp. Luggs lay down near the stove without enthusiasm. Hamish filled the kettle and waited for it to boil, listening to the uneasy silence of the village without its garish lights. "Too late to fix any of it tonight," he muttered. He wasn't sure he believed that either. Hamish woke to the phone ringing like an accusation. Mrs. Patel's voice came through, sharp and too awake for the hour. Folk were already arguing in her shop about Gordon's death. Hamish rubbed his eyes and felt the dull weight of the night before. Lugg stood by the door, tail low, sensing trouble as usual. When Hamish stepped into Patel's shop, the noise hit him at once. A crofter was insisting Gordon must have been drunk. Another said Gordon never touched liquor on a workday. A fisherwoman claimed Gordon had told her the Cranstons were cutting corners, though she couldn't remember when he had said it. Mrs. Patel gave Hamish a tight smile that meant she wished he would fix the entire village before lunch. "You'll need to clear this up," she said quietly, as if clearing up death were like sweeping a floor. Hamish only nodded. He felt too tired to argue. Lugg sat by the sweet counter, whining softly each time voices rose. No one paid attention to the dog. They rarely did unless they wanted to mention how much hair he shed. Hamish left before they could drag him into more theories. He made his way to Gordon's cottage. The small front room was dim even with the lamp on. Gordon's widow sat behind lace curtains, ramrod straight. Hamish had never known her to slouch. "I'm sorry," he said, awkward as always. She gave a short nod, refusing pity. "They'll say he was careless. He wasn't." Hamish shifted his weight, unsure what to say. She looked at him sharply, as though he were another villager ready to gossip. "He told me folk wanted the lights bigger, brighter, cheaper," she said. "Said if he refused, he'd never get work up here again. That's what the Highlands are now, Hamish. If you say no to the wrong people, you're done." He wondered who the wrong people were, but she pressed her lips tight. This was all she would give him. He thanked her, which sounded weak even to himself, and stepped back out into the wet morning. He felt colder than before. Blair's summons came just as Hamish reached the station. Anderson had delivered it with the smugness of a man pleased to pass along bad orders. Hamish trudged up the hill to the Cranstons' house, Luggs pacing beside him with ears twitching at every distant shout. Inside, Blair stood like a small, angry king. The Cranstons hovered near the fireplace, wringing their hands. A thin man in a suit, clearly from some letting office, kept glancing at the door as if he hoped to run. Blair didn't bother with greetings. "Why are you stirring things up, Macbeth? I told you it was an accident." "I'm only asking questions," Hamish said. "Then stop." Blair swung round to face the others. "You see, your local bobby here has the whole place buzzing with nonsense." Mr. Cranston's face lit with offended politeness. "We've done nothing wrong. Poor Gordon must have slipped." Mrs. Cranston sniffed loudly. The letting agent wiped his palms on his trousers as if guilt were catching. Tam, Gordon's apprentice, stood near the wall, eyes fixed on the carpet. Blair pounced on him. "You were seen near that fuse box. You were drunk, were you not?" Tam jerked his head up. I wasn't drunk, sir. I was only checking something." "Aye, in the pub checking something," Blair barked. Tam went red. He looked like a boy caught stealing biscuits. Hamish stepped forward before thinking, "He's too soft to hurt anyone." The room went silent. Tam stared at Hamish with miserable gratitude that only made the scene worse. Blair narrowed his eyes. "Too soft?" Blair said. "Is that your professional assessment, Macbeth?" Hamish felt heat crawl up his neck. He wished he could take the words back. They had sounded daft even as he said them. Blair snorted. "This lad looks guilty to me. That's what panic looks like." Hamish tried to salvage something. He pointed vaguely toward the garden. There were heavier boot prints near the cable, bigger than Tam's feet. Blair waved a hand. "Rain washes prints about. Means nothing." Hamish knew Blair hadn't even looked properly, but with the Cranstons watching and that fidgeting agent in the corner, Hamish felt his resolve thin out. He didn't press the point. He should have. Instead, he let it drop like someone else's job. Blair turned back to the Cranstons. "Macbeth here will stop poking about. Anderson, put misadventure in the report." Anderson scribbled with glad obedience. Hamish felt as if a door had shut on his face. The letting agent cleared his throat. "It would be preferable if, public discussion remained limited. Guests don't like incidents." Mrs. Cranston sniffed again. "We only wanted to bring a bit of sparkle." Hamish found himself believing them, thinking they were only silly and vain. He didn't consider they might be dangerous or hiding something. He disliked himself for that softness as soon as the thought passed. When the group finally dispersed, Blair looked satisfied enough to walk out humming. Hamish remained in the hall a moment longer, feeling lugs pressed gently against his leg. The dog's ears were back, uneasy. Outside, the air had turned colder. Hamish headed down the hill, boots sinking lightly into the wet ground where the boot prints had been. He tried to see them again in his mind, larger, deeper, but the image grew vague. By the time he reached the main road, the village gossip had already sped ahead of him. Folk peered out of windows as he passed, no doubt deciding what he had failed to do today. He couldn't blame them. He wasn't sure himself what he was meant to do anymore. At the station, Lugs curled by the stove with a discouraged sigh. Hamish sat at his small desk, staring at the blank forms Blair would want filled. He felt annoyed, not just at Blair's pleasure in shutting him up, but at himself for letting it happen. He looked out the window toward the hill where the lights had hung. The house stood dark now, the decorations hanging there unlit, looking oddly bare without their gaudy blaze. The whole business was beginning to make the village look foolish, and he had helped that along. Hamish rubbed his forehead. Something was wrong, but he'd let Blair steer the day. That mistake would only grow teeth later. He felt it already. "Tomorrow," he muttered, though he wasn't sure what tomorrow would fix. Lugs lifted his head, then settled again. Outside, Lochdu went on with its gossiping, brooding and watching, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Hamish arrived at Tommel Castle Hotel already feeling out of place, which was usual for him, but today it sat heavier. Something was wrong the moment he stepped through the door. Mr. Halberton Smythe was standing in the lobby, staring at a newspaper as if it had personally insulted him. Priscilla was beside him, elegant in a camel coat that made Hamish instantly aware of every worn thread in his own jacket. "There you are," Mr. Halberton Smythe said. "This business with the Cranstons is becoming a nuisance. Guests don't like talk of death, especially not festive death." Hamish gave a small shrug. "Folk talk." "They shouldn't," snapped the older man. "We don't want Lochdu known as the place where tourists die under fairy lights. It's ridiculous." Priscilla's eyes flicked to Hamish with that cool, unreadable look of hers. "It's unfortunate," she said. Even her sympathy sounded like it had been ironed smooth. Hamish felt himself redden. He had no desire to stand discussing death in the middle of glossy marble tiles that made his boots squeak. Before he could retreat, Priscilla added, "We've decided to invite the Cranstons for dinner. It may soothe things." Hamish blinked. "Dinner?" "Yes," said Mr. Halberton Smythe. "A civilized meal. Try not to look disapproving, it frightens people." Hamish wasn't aware he looked disapproving, but he didn't argue. Lugg stayed close to his heel, nose twitching at smells from the kitchen. A few tourists walked past them, staring at Hamish as if the sight of a village policeman might lower the property's value. The Cranstons arrived shortly after. They were dressed as though expecting a royal invitation rather than a strained dinner designed to smooth over bad publicity. Mrs. Cranston clasped her bag like a shield. Mr. Cranston gave a stiff bow to Priscilla, who barely noticed. They all sat at a polished table that made Hamish feel like a schoolboy called up to the rector's office. Priscilla sat tall and composed. Hamish tried not to slouch. The Cranstons' eyes kept darting around the room, their awe so obvious it embarrassed everyone but themselves. "We're so grateful for the invitation," Mrs. Cranston said brightly. "Such a lovely hotel." Priscilla gave a polite smile that could have frozen tea. "We thought it might help calm matters." Hamish watched them both. They didn't seem dangerous, just silly, far too silly to be tied to a man's death. The thought settled wrongly in him, but he ignored it. Mr. Cranston cleared his throat. "Of course, if folk want us to tone down the lights, well, we'd consider it. After the inquest, naturally. One wouldn't want to interfere before then." Priscilla nodded once. "That sounds reasonable." Hamish felt out of place, irrelevant, and annoyed at himself for caring. He caught Priscilla looking at him again, her expression unreadable, as usual. "You can't fight every foolish thing, Hamish," she said quietly. "Let it settle." The words stung more than they should. Hamish felt pride prick at him like a thistle. He straightened a little. "Aye, well, maybe I should keep out of it altogether. Strathbane will handle it." He regretted the words the moment they left him. Priscilla only gave a small nod as if she'd expected nothing better. Dinner dragged on. The Cranstons talked too much, trying too hard to be pleasant. Hamish answered stiffly, aware of his scruffy uniform and the smear of peat smoke on his sleeve. Luggs was not allowed inside, so the dog sat outside the door, occasionally giving a soft huff that echoed faintly down the hall. Hamish envied him. After the meal, Hamish tried to slip away. The hotel's handyman, a wiry fellow named Rab, intercepted him near the side corridor. "You should watch yourself with all this," Rab muttered. Hamish frowned. "What now?" Rab checked over his shoulder, lowering his voice. "Gordon did a wee wiring job up here once. Quiet work, for a man from the letting agency. Important, they said. Didn't want it on paper." "Who?" Hamish asked. Rab shook his head. "Not my business to say." He walked away before Hamish could press him. Hamish stood there a moment, irritated. Folk in Lochdu had a way of offering half information and then acting offended if you asked for the rest. Rab's hint sat badly in his mind, like something dropped behind a piece of furniture. Outside, night had come on thick, with a steady drift of rain across the loch. Luggs greeted him with a soft whine, shaking droplets from his coat. Hamish scratched the dog's ear out of habit more than affection. He stood looking toward the hill. The Cranstons' house, still gaudy even dimmed by weather, glowed faintly through the mist. He felt tired again, and foolish. If the English wanted their hill to look like a Christmas postcard, he supposed they had the right. Let them burn through their electricity bills and their reputation. It wasn't his problem. Yet he couldn't quite shake the image of Gordon MacFarlane lying awkwardly in the mud beneath those dead lights. "None of my business," he muttered. Even to himself it sounded like a lie. Luggs pressed close, shivering a little, and Hamish started down the path toward the station. The loch air had a damp bite to it, and the village lights looked small and weary. Tomorrow would bring more trouble. He could feel it. Something was already wrong when Hamish stepped into Patel's shop that morning. Folk were queued up with tight mouths, waving their electricity bills like proof of a personal insult. Luggs hesitated at the doorway, ears dipping back at the sharp voices. Mrs. Patel beckoned Hamish behind the counter. "You'll need to look into this," she murmured. "Bills are up all over the place, since those lights went up." A crofter at the till cut in. "My power flickered twice last night. If the beasts get startled, I'll hold you responsible, Hamish." Hamish gave a weary shrug. "You should call the power board." "They tell us to call you," Mrs. Patel said pointedly. Before Hamish could answer, Mrs. Wellington swept in, dramatic as a stage curtain. "If my freezer fails, that'll be murder. Never mind poor Gordon. Murder." She slapped her bill onto the counter. "Daylight robbery." The villagers turned to Hamish as though he had personally rerouted the national grid. Their expectant silence was worse than shouting. "Aye, well," he said, "I'll look." He didn't want to look. He wanted one quiet day. but Lochdu rarely allowed that. Later, in the cluttered Strathbane Power office, a clerk with a pudding face shoved a thin file at him. "Everything's within tolerance," the man said without interest. "Seasonal load and all that." "Folk say the supply's erratic," Hamish said. "That's rural lines for you." The clerk returned to his crossword. "Nothing we can do." It was the kind of bored dismissal that made Hamish feel both invisible and accused. He left with nothing but a headache and the faint annoyance that came from being patronised by someone who had never seen a storm hit a Highland cable. Back at the Cranstons' house, Mrs. Cranston fussed her way to the kitchen, while Mr. Cranston tried to act helpful without lifting a finger. Hamish ignored them both. He stepped outside to the wall where the main cables ran. Lugs padded after him, ears pricked. The rain had settled into a steady, mean drizzle. Hamish crouched by the switchboard. Something looked wrong at once. A junction box, newer than the rest, had been spliced in roughly. The workmanship was crude. He touched it with the back of his hand. Cold, damp, and recently handled. "Did Gordon put this here?" Hamish called. Mr. Cranston blinked at the box, as though seeing it for the first time. "No idea. He was always tinkering with things." Mrs. Cranston put a hand to her throat. That electrician was very enthusiastic. In the kitchen, Hamish noticed a drawer left slightly open. Inside lay a stack of unpaid invoices. Gordon's handwriting, spiky and impatient. "Christmas special, additional works." A few numbers were circled. Hamish couldn't tell if it meant more work done or more money owed. Probably both. It made Gordon look greedy, or desperate, or simply untidy. Hard to know. "Should have known he'd overcharge," Mrs. Cranston said lightly, though her eyes were too bright. Hamish didn't trust that tone. It was the tone of people who cleaned before the police arrived. He found Mrs. Chalmers, the decorator, upstairs stripping old wallpaper. She glanced at him without stopping her scraping. "Did you know Gordon well?" he asked. "Well enough to see he was a chancer," she said briskly. "All men with wires are. They tell you it's complicated so they can charge double. He rushed the job here, told him so myself." Hamish stiffened. He didn't like her manner or her certainty, but it nudged something in him. Maybe Gordon had been careless. Folk in the village had said as much. "Did you see him near the junction outside?" he asked. She gave him a contemptuous look. "I've enough to do without watching daft men fall off ladders." That was all she offered. She turned back to the wall, scraping away like a woman peeling the skin off a memory. Hamish left more irritated than he'd arrived. He found the Cranstons chatting in the hall, pretending calm. He didn't bother asking them anything else. By the time he stepped back into Patel's shop, the gossip had multiplied. Folk wanted answers. So he said, offhand and foolishly, maybe Gordon wasn't as careful as they thought. The shop went quiet. Mrs. Patel's eyebrows lifted, and even old Mrs. Wellington paused mid-rant. "Are you saying it was Gordon's fault?" she demanded. "I'm saying nothing for certain," Hamish muttered. But it was too late. The words were out, already taking on a life of their own. By tea-time, Gordon's widow had heard every twisted version. Hamish didn't need to see her to feel the hurt of it. The bill he'd been handed that morning, the villagers' rising anger, had doubled now, and his name was written on it in red ink. He walked home through fine, needling rain that clung to his hair and made his cuffs heavy. Lugs trotted beside him, uneasy, pressing close each time Hamish slowed. The dog could sense things going wrong long before humans did. Hamish kept his gaze on the road ahead. He didn't want to think about Gordon's widow, or the Cranstons, or that crude junction box. He didn't want to admit he'd let the village pressure him into speaking too soon, too carelessly. "Should have kept my mouth shut," he muttered. The wind carried the words away. Lochdu sat in the damp distance waiting for the next mistake he would no doubt make. The trouble had already begun by the time Hamish stepped outside that morning. Someone had scrawled "Boycott the Gaudy Palace" on a bit of cardboard and nailed it crookedly to the railing outside Patel's shop. Lugs sniffed it and gave a low growl, not at the words, but at the mood hanging in the air. Inside, Mrs. Patel served customers with a politeness stretched thin as old pastry. A group of villagers huddled near the bread rack, speaking in lowered, poisonous tones. "No sense giving them business," one crofter said. "Folk can stay at the hotel instead." "Aye, and tourists should be told what happened up there," another added, pretending innocence while glancing at Hamish. "For their own safety, of course." Hamish pretended not to hear. Gossip was one thing, but now they had the flavour of action about them. Mrs. Patel caught his eye and gave him a small, warning shake of the head, as if telling him to leave well enough alone. He wished he could. By evening the village mood had curdled properly. A raw wind came down off the hills, sharp enough to make the loch slap irritably at the shore. Hamish, out on his rounds, saw the Cranstons' house suddenly go dark. Not the usual flicker, a full blackout. He trudged up the slope through the wet grass, lugs padding close. When they reached the garden, the sight looked almost comical at first. Plastic reindeer on their sides, legs stuck upward like dead beetles, strings of lights slashed clean through, and a Santa figure floating face down in a ditch. But the neatness of the cut said someone had taken their time. Before Hamish could absorb it, Mrs. Cranston burst from the front door. "Constable, look! They've attacked our display!" Hamish crouched, running his fingers along a severed strand. Smooth cut, not torn. Vandals who took pride in their work. He had no answer ready, and Mrs. Cranston's trembling outrage made it feel as if he were to blame. Word travelled ahead of him. Blair arrived before dawn, red-eyed and furious, stamping into Patel's shop as if it were his own office. "Criminal damage," he roared. "Someone up here thinks they're above the law." Folks scattered between the tinned goods and the tea shelves. Hamish stood by the counter, wishing himself invisible. Blair rounded on him. "You've been soft on them, Macbeth, too soft, I warned you. And now look." Hamish said nothing. Blair did not want answers. He wanted a throat to grab. "Your precious crofters have mouths on them," Blair continued, voice rising. "That Lachlan, I heard him in the pub. Pull the plug," he said. "Teach them a lesson," his words. Hamish stiffened. "Folks say stupid things when drink's in them." Blair jabbed a finger at him. "You know fine it'll be Lachlan or one of his pals. Admit it." Hamish felt the pressure bearing down. Blair's triumph was almost gleeful. He thought of Lachlan, stubborn, kind, and thick as peat sometimes. A man who said too much but did little. A man Hamish couldn't picture slashing up plastic reindeer. "I was with Lachlan last night," Hamish heard himself say. The lie came too quickly. He wasn't near the house. Blair's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" "Aye." Blair didn't believe him. It hung in the air like damp, but it stalled him for the moment, which Hamish had wanted, even if he regretted wanting it. But lies did not stick to the people Hamish wished they would. Later that morning, on the road near Lachlan's Croft, Hamish spotted the man struggling with a tarpaulin. Lugs barked, and Lachlan turned, guilt flickering across his face too fast to hide. "You didn't tell Blair I'd said anything foolish?" Lachlan asked. "No," Hamish said. "You're safe." Then Hamish's eye caught it. A dark smear on Lachlan's sleeve. Black paint, thin, clinging, like the paint on the reindeer decorations. Hamish stared at it too long. "It's from the shed," Lachlan said quickly. "I was painting a gate this morning." Hamish nodded, pretending to accept it. He felt the lie he'd told earlier settle like a stone in his stomach. Protecting Lachlan had been instinct, but now he wasn't sure whether he'd shielded the right man. Before he could think further, the phone at the station rang. Daviot's sharp, strained voice crackled down the line. "Macbeth, I'm hearing rumours. Christmas hooliganism in Loch Dhu. The papers sniffing about. Sort this out immediately. If there's one more incident, you'll find yourself transferred somewhere dreary. Don't test me." Hamish muttered an obedient "yes, sir," while staring at the peeling paint on his office wall. Lugs, sensing the mood, tucked himself under the desk. Across the day, the village cracked apart. Folk argued openly on the street. "They deserved it," one fisherman said. "Ugly lights, ugly manners." "How can you say that?" Mrs. Patel snapped. "It's vandalism." "Aye, but tasteful vandalism," someone muttered. Hamish stepped between two men squaring up near the pier. Both glared at him as though he were personally ruining their entertainment. By nightfall, wet mist crawled through Loch Dhu, clinging to doorways and turning every window into a faint blurred glow. Hamish trudged back to the station, his boots heavy with muck. Lugs padded behind him, tail low. Inside, the peat fire sputtered half-heartedly, as if even it disapproved of the day. Hamish sat before it, elbows on knees, annoyance gnawing at him. He had lied to Blair, protected Lachlan. And for what? A smudge of paint had undone any certainty he had. Lugs settled at his feet, giving a small, worried rumble. Hamish didn't look at him. He stared into the weak fire, knowing the night held more trouble than warmth. The day began badly, which was becoming a habit. The postmistress marched straight into the station without knocking, lugs rising with a low rumble that she ignored. "This came for you," she said, dropping an envelope onto Hamish's desk as if it were a dead mouse. "From Gordon's widow. Best you read it quick. She's telling folk you've blackened her husband's name." Hamish felt a twist of guilt before he even opened it. The letter inside was short, the handwriting tight and angry. She accused him of siding with Blair, of spreading talk that Gordon had been careless, and of making her grief harder. It wasn't entirely fair, but grief rarely was, and Hamish had no answer to give her. Before he could decide what to do, the news of the inquest reached him. Accidental death. Blair strutted down Lochdu's main street like a bantam rooster, telling anyone in reach that common sense has prevailed. Each time he passed Hamish, he offered a smug nod, as if the ruling proved Blair's brilliance. Hamish kept quiet. He told himself he should let the matter lie. Maybe the junction box meant nothing. Maybe Gordon had slipped. Maybe the whole village would stop sharpening their tongues on one another soon. But the letter in his pocket sat like a stone. That night a storm rolled in, not dramatic, but persistent and unpleasant. Wind slapped the loch, and the rain came in heavy slanting sheets that blurred the hillside lights until they looked like smudged chalk. The Cranstons had switched the decorations back on despite the vandalism, claiming it was for a charity collection. Folk muttered that it was for attention. Hamish was on his usual round when Lug stopped dead in the road, one paw lifted. The dog stared up at the hillside, ears stiff. "What now?" Hamish muttered. Then he saw it, a faint orange flicker behind the coloured bulbs, too low for lightning, too steady for a reflection. A bad glow, the kind that meant trouble no one wanted. The phone rang in the station minutes later. Someone at the Cranstons' house screeched, "There's smoke in the back corridor! Fire!" Hamish didn't bother replying. He ran. Lugs charged ahead, his barks lost in the wind. When Hamish reached the house, the front door hung open, the Cranstons shouting over one another like startled hens. The smell of burning plastic drifted through the hall. Hamish pushed past them and followed the smoke to a narrow corridor lined with cheap tinsel. Light from the decorations outside seeped weakly through the windows, giving the smoke a streaked, sickly look. A patch of skirting board glowed with a thin line of fire. Hamish tore down the tinsel and stamped the flames out, coughing as burnt dust and melted plastic rose around him. He knelt, eyes watering, and saw the truth clearly. A section of cable had been stripped bare before someone tucked it neatly back under the garland. A spark had found it. The fire had been waiting to happen, not careless, not accidental. "Someone tried to burn the place," Hamish muttered, though no one heard him. Mrs. Cranston sobbed behind him. Mr. Cranston hovered helplessly, holding a bucket of water but unsure where to throw it. Blair arrived soon after, splashing through puddles and looking furious that he had been pulled out into the storm. Anderson trailed behind him, notebook already damp. "What's this mess now?" Blair snapped. "Fire," Hamish said, brushing soot off his sleeve. "Deliberate. The casing was stripped clean." Blair squinted at the damaged wire as if it personally offended him. "You and your dog are seeing ghosts in the wiring, Macbeth. Folk put up decorations too fast, things rub, sparks happen." Hamish shook his head. "Not this. Someone did it on purpose." Blair let out a bark of laughter. "Aye, and who? Santa Claus. You're chasing shadows. The inquest says accident, and I stand by it." Hamish felt the weight of his earlier weakness. He had agreed too easily before. Letting Blair lead him had been a mistake, and now the case stood crooked because he hadn't pushed when he should have. He stood slowly. "Someone wants these lights as cover. For what, I don't know yet." Blair's eyes gleamed with irritation. "You'll drop this, Macbeth. Daviot won't want his holidays ruined with your fantasies." Hamish didn't answer. He didn't bother arguing. Blair never listened, and Hamish didn't have the energy to shout over the wind. Instead, he stepped outside. The storm hit him full in the face, cold and sharp. The lights on the house flickered, as if uncertain whether to stay lit or give up. Lugs nudged Hamish's leg, whining softly. "Aye," Hamish said to the dog. "It's getting worse." The rain softened for a moment, only long enough for the wind to change direction and spray him again. Hamish looked up at the gaudy hillside, the decorations still glowing despite the fire. They looked wrong now, not silly but dangerous. Someone was hiding behind them. He didn't know who, he didn't know why, but he knew he would have to go on pushing, even if Blair mocked him, and the village blamed him, and the Cranstons cried on each other like startled birds. He turned toward Lochdu, the faint lights of the village wavering in the storm. Lug stayed close. The night felt unsettled, as if the hill itself were bracing for the next trouble. Hamish walked on, soaked and uneasy, knowing he couldn't let this lie any more. The first thing wrong was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Lochdu hardly knew the meaning of that, but the tight, watchful kind that meant folk were pretending nothing was happening while thinking of nothing else. By mid-morning, 3 villagers had already told Hamish with strained cheer that the Cranstons were planning to flee south before someone torched the rest of their decorations. Lugs paced near Hamish's heel outside the station, ears twitching. Even the dog felt the tension. Hamish hadn't finished locking the door when Mr. Halberton Smythe's rover pulled up with unnecessary flourish. "Macbeth," he said, stepping out as though descending from a throne. "I've spoken with the Cranstons. They wanted to close the house and run off, but that won't do, not with guests arriving. The hotel's name must remain untarnished." Hamish rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Folk are on edge. A fire." "Which you will not mention again," Mr. Halberton Smythe cut in. "They'll host a charity open evening instead. Show everyone that Lochdu is safe, civilised. A little provincial fussing needn't become national embarrassment." Hamish tried to argue, but the man swept away like a ship ignoring the lighthouse. Lug snorted. Invitations went out within hours. Priscilla delivered Hamish's herself, stepping into the station in an emerald dress that made him feel taller and scruffier than usual. She held out the envelope with a polite, distant expression. "Do attend, Hamish. If the evening goes badly, the hotel will suffer. Do try not to make a scene." He felt the words settle like a stone. "I don't make scenes." She didn't smile. "You do sometimes." Hamish had no answer that wouldn't embarrass him further. Lug, sensing his discomfort, pressed against his leg. That night, the Cranstons' house blazed with light again, though folk approached it as if entering a museum they didn't like. Inside, crofters stood stiffly with paper cups of punch, pretending it didn't taste like boiled fruit rinds. Tourists cooed over the view, saying things like charming and rustic, irritating everyone who had ever lived in the Highlands. Hamish stayed near the wall, Lugs at his feet. Every raised voice made the dog flick an ear. The air felt too warm, too bright, and too forced. Hamish's eye caught the Strathbane holiday letting agent lingering near the switches. The man pretended to admire a wreath, but he kept glancing at the meter cupboard as though expecting it to explode. Hamish watched him a moment, but before he could approach, Mrs. Chalmers appeared in a corner, speaking sharply with Lachlan. She jabbed a finger at him. Lachlan muttered something defensive, shifting like a schoolboy being scolded. "Strange pair," Hamish murmured. Lugs thumped his tail once, uncertain. Moving through the crowd, Hamish followed a heavy cable snaking from the meter cupboard out toward the back garden. It was new, thicker than the earlier wiring, the insulation too clean for Highland weather. He pushed open the back door to follow it. But Mrs. Cranston suddenly stepped in front of him, her strained smile stretched thin enough to show nerves beneath. "Constable, must you poke about? People are here to enjoy themselves." "It won't take a moment," Hamish said. "We want no interruptions tonight. Please." The "please" had teeth. Hamish hesitated. Priscilla's warning echoed in his head. "Don't make a scene." He stepped back, annoyed with himself. Inside, the agent had vanished into the crowd. Mrs. Chalmers now glared at Lachlan as though blaming him for weather patterns. The cable lay half hidden under a rug, taunting him with whatever truth lay at its end. Hamish found Priscilla near the Christmas tree, speaking quietly with her father's guests. He waited until the group drifted away. She looked at him with that calm distance he had always disliked. "Priscilla," he said, "some of your father's important guests might know more about this business than they're letting on." Her face went still, elegant as a closed gate. "You're very good at resenting people, Hamish. Less good at proving anything." The words hit harder than intended, or perhaps exactly as intended. Hamish felt his temper rise, a rare and unwelcome visitor. "You asked me not to make a scene," he said. "Maybe folk wouldn't make scenes if they weren't being lied to." Priscilla's expression did not change. "If you have something, show it. If not, stop grasping at shadows." Hamish stepped back, humiliated by how easily she could make him doubt himself. The noise of the party grew louder, brittle and false. Lugs pressed against his shin, uneasy. He walked toward the exit without saying goodbye. The hall behind him buzzed with forced cheer, while the real tension curled through the house like smoke. Outside, the cold air hit his lungs hard. The hillside lights flickered, bright and hollow. Hamish stood under them, angry and unsure of everyone, including himself. The cable waited unseen in the dark garden. The agent lurked somewhere in the house. Lachlan and Mrs. Chalmers whispered in corners, and Priscilla's words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Hamish tugged his coat tighter and started down the path toward Loch Dhu, Lugs following with quiet steps. Nothing felt settled, and something was waiting to break. The trouble showed itself before Hamish had even finished his morning tea. Lugs barked at the door, sharp and uneasy, and when Hamish stepped outside, he saw villagers gathered along the road like folk staring at a crash. A crude sign had been hammered into the verge, the paint still dripping. "Turn back. Dangerous electrics. One dead already." Mrs. Patel stood with her arms folded. "We opened at 8:30, she said. "That thing was waiting for us." "It's daft," Hamish said, though the words felt thin. "Daft or not," muttered a crofter, "tourists will see it." They already had. 2 visitors took photographs before Hamish could tell them to clear off. Lugs growled, but the dog couldn't scare off curiosity. By mid-morning, the Strathbane paper had its say. A customer in Patel's shop ostentatiously read it aloud. "Loch Dhu, the murder Christmas village." The word murder clanged through the shop like someone dropping a pot. Folk turned to Hamish as if expecting him to scrub it off the page by hand. Before he could gather a reply, the station phone rang. Daviot's breathless voice burst through the receiver. "Macbeth, bad publicity. Terrible timing. You must show decisive policing. Make an arrest. Today." "On what grounds?" Hamish asked. "On the grounds that we need one," Daviot snapped, then hung up. Hamish stood staring at the phone. Lugs whined softly, ears back. The real storm arrived in the shape of Blair, striding into Patel's shop like an avenging angel in a cheap raincoat. Anderson followed, notebook already open. "I've got him," Blair announced, loud enough to make Mrs. Wellington jump. "You're vandal, you're firebug." Folk shifted, uneasy. Hamish felt his stomach drop. "Lachlan McRae," Blair declared, "our crofter friend, violent temper, history with the dead electrician, and—" Blair shot Hamish a poisonous look. "Alibied by Macbeth here." Hamish tried to speak. "I only said he was—" Blair cut him off. "You lied, Macbeth, you know you did, and you lied to protect him." Lachlan stood near the back of the shop, hands in his pockets, face blank with shock. His wife clutched his arm, whispering his name. Lugs pressed close to Hamish's leg, whining. Blair pointed dramatically at Lachlan. "Cuffs, Anderson." Anderson hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping forward. The click of metal seemed to split the room. Lachlan stared at Hamish, not angry, just wounded. "I didn't do anything," he said quietly. Hamish's throat tightened. "I know, Lachlan. Just stay calm." But calm was impossible when the whole village stared as though witnessing a hanging. Blair, enjoying himself, barked. "Charges, vandalism, suspected arson, possible involvement in Gordon MacFarlane's death." He paused to let the shock land, then added smugly, "And resisting an officer if he doesn't move right now." Lachlan's wife burst into tears. "Hamish, you said you'd look after us. You said—" Hamish had no defence. His earlier lie sat like a stone in his gut, heavy and unavoidable. He had handed Blair the rope. As Blair frog-marched Lachlan outside, a quiet fisherman tugged Hamish's sleeve. "I saw a car," he whispered, glancing around as though the bushes might report him. "Strathbane plates, near the substation. Couple of times, long before any lights went up." Hamish frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" The man shifted. "Folk talk enough already. And Blair, well—" He glanced toward the handcuffs clinking down the road. He'd no listen. It was a clue, small but solid, and utterly useless now that Lachlan was being shoved into Blair's car like a sack of grain. Hamish's failure sat in the open where everyone could see it. By the time Hamish reached the station, Blair was already triumphantly dictating notes to Anderson. "He knows nothing about wiring," Hamish said, trying to keep his voice steady. Blair didn't bother hiding his smirk. "Then he'll have plenty of time in a cell to think about where he was when those lights were cut, or when that fire started." Hamish stepped closer. "He didn't do it." "Your opinion," Blair said lightly. Hasn't impressed me much this week." Hamish felt himself flush, a mix of anger and self-reproach. He had no clever misdirection left, no lie that wouldn't make everything worse. His own incompetence, real or feigned, had boxed him in. Lugs gave a sharp whine, tail tucked. The dog hated raised voices as much as Hamish hated using them. When Hamish walked back out into the hard grey morning, villagers watched him with cold disappointment. Gordon's widow passed him on the street without even a nod. He stood for a long moment by the loch, the air damp and heavy. Lachlan would sit in a cell because Hamish had covered for him, because he had thought Blair could be stalled, because he hadn't trusted his own instincts soon enough, and whoever had truly tampered with the lights was still free. Lugs leaned against his leg, trembling slightly. "Aye," Hamish murmured, "I've made a right mess of it." The wind carried no answer, only the stillness of a village losing faith one day at a time. Blair was already shouting before Hamish reached the gate of the Cranstons' house. The wind carried his voice downhill in ragged bursts, as if even the weather found him tiresome. "You'd better be right about this, Macbeth. I'm not standing out here all night for one of your Highland hunches." Hamish stopped beside him, Lugs leaning close to avoid the gusts. The night was raw and unsettled, the loch a black smear under the wind. The damaged lights on the house flickered as if uncertain they wanted to shine at all. "It's one last switching on," Hamish said, keeping his voice mild. "If the vandal turns up again, you can take the credit." Blair sniffed in satisfaction. Anderson hovered behind him, notebook clutched like a shield. Inside, the atmosphere was worse than the weather. The Cranstons rattled about the living room, trying to be cheerful and failing. The holiday letting agent stood by the window, pretending to admire the view but twitching like a guilty spaniel. A few villagers had come out of curiosity or spite. Priscilla was there too, neat as a magazine page, watching Hamish with that cool distance that always made him feel like a badly prepared schoolboy. "Let's get this over with," Mr. Cranston said, rubbing his hands. "One more show of Christmas spirit." Hamish nodded but said nothing. His plan was simple, and it had to be. He had asked a lineman from the power company to help adjust a section of wiring, just enough so that if anyone tampered with it again, a run of lights would fail instantly. There was no genius in it, just a quiet trap that might catch a careless hand. He stood back as Blair marched pompously to the switchboard. "This time," Blair declared, "we shall have order." A few villagers rolled their eyes. Hamish kept his gaze on the back corridor. Blair threw the switch with unnecessary flourish. For a moment the entire hillside erupted in colour, gaudy reds, greens and golds flooding the night like a badly aimed firework display. The Cranstons clapped, a tourist cooed. Then, just as Hamish hoped, the long run of lights leading toward the back corridor sputtered, flickered and died. Gasps went up. Blair swore loudly. What now? But Hamish wasn't listening to him. Someone at the far end of the room had slipped away, moving too quickly, too quietly. Lugs growled, hackles rising. "Stay," Hamish murmured to the dog, though Lugs ignored him and followed anyway. Down the dim corridor, the meter cupboard hung slightly ajar. The faint glow of a torch flickered inside. Hamish pushed the door wider. The holiday letting agent jerked upright, screwdriver in one hand, a length of stripped wire in the other. His face twisted in irritation rather than fear. "You again," he muttered. "Nosy man." Hamish kept his tone even. "What are you doing?" "Checking the fault," the agent snapped. "That's my job." "No," Hamish said. "Your job is letting holiday houses, not rewiring them in the dark." The agent sneered. "You can't prove anything. The wiring's a shambles already. Anyone could have touched it." Hamish stepped closer, eyes on the man's hands. The stripped wire gleamed in the torch beam. "That junction box at the bottom of the hill, you oversaw that installation, didn't you? Odd that Gordon had invoices for additional works to your agency, and that a Strathbane car was seen at the substation weeks before the lights went up." The agent's jaw tightened. A small, dangerous silence hung between them. "You don't know what you're talking about," the man hissed. "These people were ready to sell. I was helping things along. Highland houses are overpriced anyway." Before Hamish could reply, Blair barreled into the corridor with Anderson behind him. "What's all this? Macbeth, you better not be wasting—" Blair stopped when he saw the wire, the screwdriver, the guilty face. His own expression went sour as though discovering the villain ruined his day. "Right," Blair snapped. "You. Hands where I can see them." The agent tried to protest, but Blair grabbed him none too gently. Anderson looked relieved to finally have something concrete to write down. Hamish stepped back, letting Blair bluster. "So it was you," Blair growled. "Tampering with lights, starting fires, frightening people at Christmas. You've made a circus out of the whole season." The agent tried to twist free. "This is ridiculous." Blair cuffed him smartly. "Save it for Strathbane." The Cranstons hovered at the corridor entrance, faces pale. Priscilla stood behind them, her expression unreadable. Hamish met her gaze for the briefest moment. She inclined her head, an acknowledgement with no warmth in it. He didn't know whether she approved or merely thought he'd made trouble in a more competent way than usual. Blair dragged the agent out into the wind, shouting orders to Anderson as they went. Villagers craned their necks to watch. Someone clapped. Someone else muttered that it had been obvious all along. Hamish knew it hadn't been obvious. Not to him, anyway. He stepped outside. The damaged lights blinked weakly against the night, their colours distorted by the wind. The loch lay dark, cold, indifferent. Luggs nudged his hand, whining very softly. Hamish rubbed the dog's ears. "Aye, lad, it's not over yet." Because though the culprit was caught, the village wasn't healed. Lachlan was still in a cell. Gordon's widow still blamed him, and Priscilla stood somewhere behind him, a reminder that he could solve a crime but never settle his own heart. The wind rose again, rattling the broken reindeer on the lawn. Hamish turned toward Lochdu, uneasy, and started down the hill with Luggs trotting at his side. Something was wrong with the quiet again, not the sharp, dangerous quiet of suspicion, but the flattened sort that follows too many public embarrassments. When Hamish stepped outside the station that morning, Luggs pressed against his leg, uneasy, though nothing moved on the street. The Cranstons' house on the hill was dull now, most of the decorations removed. Only a single string of white bulbs clung to the porch, glowing weakly in the dim morning. Mrs. Wellington marched past him, lifting her chin. "A judgment on vulgarity," she announced to no one in particular, "and about time." Across the road, Mrs. Patel was stacking boxes outside the shop door. "Half-price tinsel," she murmured. "Folk won't touch it, but it's better than leaving it in back." She didn't look at Hamish, which was her way of saying that Lochdu had behaved shamefully enough for one Christmas. Inside the Kirk Hall that afternoon, a small, sour gathering tried to look official. A hand-painted sign read "Future Christmas Displays," as if pretending it was a formal council meeting might cover the bruises of the last few weeks. Crofters and shopkeepers muttered to one another. No one sat beside Hamish. He took a chair at the back and tried to make himself small. The arguments began quickly. "We should have one tree next year." "One," snapped Mrs. Wellington. "Supervised." "Supervised by who?" asked a fisherman. "You?" "At least I didn't cut anyone's decorations," she shot back. "That was never proved," someone murmured. No one admitted to anything. Shame and pride twisted together until the whole meeting sagged beneath it. Hamish listened. He had no interest in rules about fairy lights. He watched Gordon's widow instead. She stood up only once, her voice steady but thin. "I've had word from Strathbane," she said. "They found papers of my husband's. He'd been fighting that agency for weeks. Told them the wiring was unsafe. They pushed him to do more for less. He didn't tell me. Didn't want trouble." A rustle of discomfort moved across the hall. Folk avoided one another's eyes. After the meeting, she approached Hamish quietly. "There's something else," she said. "A letter he wrote, never posted." She handed over a folded sheet, creased and smudged by many readings. Hamish opened it. Gordon's handwriting was rough and impatient. "If anything happens to me up at that blasted house, look at the folk from Strathbane, not the village." Hamish folded it again, his thoughts brief and dry. Too late, but right all the same. When he stepped outside, Priscilla was waiting on the path. Her coat was buttoned neatly, her suitcase beside her. She was going south again. "Leaving early?" Hamish asked, dared. "A day sooner than planned." She studied him a moment. "You were right to push about the wiring, and wrong to lie for Lachlan." Hamish shifted his weight. "Aye, well, folk like him don't have anyone else." A small pause. She seemed to consider answering, then thought better of it. "Goodbye, Hamish." She walked toward the pier with her usual controlled grace, and Hamish knew, as he always knew, that whatever world she lived in, he'd never fit inside it. Luggs gave a soft whine, watching her go. Back at the station, Hamish fed the dog and coaxed the peat fire into life. The flame caught slowly, reluctant in the damp evening. He sat on the edge of his desk and looked out the window toward the dark hillside. Only that thin line of white lights remained around the Cranstons' porch, shivering in the wind. "Too much light's bad for you anyway," he muttered. Lachlan was back at his croft by then, free again, though folk still crossed the road rather than meet his eye. Lug sighed deeply and curled at his feet. Outside, Lochdu settled back into itself, dim, ordinary, and carrying its grudges quietly, while winter pressed in again, neither kind nor cruel, simply familiar.